It's my pleasure to introduce Maria Horton, who's the founder of MSEC Incorporated, and also Leo Wong, who's the Deputy Chief Information Security Officer of the Food and Nutrition Service of the Department of Agriculture. If you could come up here, please. Maria?
Thanks, Dennis.
You're welcome.
They have new mics, so we'll find out, but I can usually talk in this size room very well. I want to welcome all of you today to our forum. This is a chance for you to have a dialogue about privacy. It's one of the things that we wanted to set off and get the year started with. If you've been looking in the news, there's quite a bit on privacy. But our goal today is to have a discussion on the different aspects of privacy and the implications related to cybersecurity. One of the reasons Dennis asked you all to move to the middle is at some point today we're going to ask you to join different tables to take part in different aspects of the discussion so that our goal is to find ideas that we might have the SIG from IAC research and produce at MOC or ELC this year. And it's important that we get you to ask questions, explore some of the privacy issues that maybe you are experiencing, or some of those that just interest you. So I would ask you today to give us your ideas, your thoughts, and even some of your pet peeves if they're out there about privacy so that we can explore them together.
Yeah, thanks, Maria. So just want to kind of set the table in terms of what we're going to be discussing today. So we'll be talking about privacy and how it intersects with cybersecurity. And the reason why we decided to have this panel for ACT-I is we feel like privacy is becoming more and more of an issue. And as we can see in the news today, people want to know what's happening with their data. And then as the government looks towards moving in terms of big data, aggregating data, moving data, and having shrinking data sets together and sharing data across agencies, we just want to kind of discuss what are ramifications. And one of the things that we want to do early on is kind of set the definition of privacy and then talk about how it is that agencies and industry can share data and what we can do to help protect that data. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our opening speaker. It's Peter Miller. He's the Chief Privacy Officer for the Federal Trade Commission, and he's going to give some remarks on what he sees in terms of privacy in this field. Peter? Thanks.
Thank you, Leo, Maria, Dennis. Thank you, folks. It's great to be here. I feel a little bit like I'm back in school, and there's everyone sitting in the back row. So I may call on you based on what you're wearing or how you look if I don't get any sort of participation. I will tell you that generally my preference is to do what we're going to be doing after I finish speaking, which is talking in groups. Privacy is really about talking. It's about asking questions. It's about discussing. I'm going to sort of give you some overarching principles. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about sort of how I look at privacy, but with the caveat that it's all incredibly subjective. There are very few answers, lots of questions. Before I do that, first let me wish you a happy Data Privacy Day. And the second part is let me give you everybody's favorite disclaimer. My appearance here today, my comments here today, my slides here today are mine alone. They do not purport to be on behalf of the Federal Trade Commission or any of its commissioners, or as I like to think about it, the more useful, helpful, and provocative my comments, the less likely they are to trace back to my employer. So I know it says in the agenda that what I'm going to be talking to you about is the implications to cybersecurity. Actually, my slides have a slightly different title, and I want to explain it to you. I think everybody in the room at some point has had the experience where somebody involved in a privacy function in some capacity, whether it's a chief privacy officer like me, somebody who's a privacy manager, has said no. And we've all at various points thought to ourselves that privacy is a deep, dark, black hole that is only a waste of time and money. So what I want to talk about is how do we move past that notion that privacy is a no function, that privacy is something where when you talk about privacy, what you're talking about is something that is opposed to your organization's mission, whether you're in the public sector or the private sector. And I think increasingly, this is not going to come as a surprise. It's clear that as we talk about cybersecurity, as we talk about privacy, functions that had previously been siloed are really starting to move together now. On the public sector side, we've got NIST Special Publication 853 Rev 4 Appendix J, which formally incorporates privacy controls into the pre-existing information security controls, and FISMA actually, and NIST and FISMA both have actually recognized the importance of this by changing the title of the publication, so it's no longer just information security, it's information security and privacy. On the private sector side, we don't necessarily see that same level of formal privacy controls and integration, but what we do see in the forthcoming NIST cybersecurity framework, the Public-Private Initiative, is a specific application of privacy-related applications, so considerations that should be worked through as you're working through the cybersecurity implications. So it's clear that there's this increasing trend toward privacy and cybersecurity working together, and it really makes a lot of sense when you think about it. One of my colleagues talks about cybersecurity and information security as being the way businesses protect their own information, and its own information writ large. When we talk about privacy, we're talking about personal information. And although I am a lawyer, although I was a litigator for 20 years, you'll be happy to know I'm not going to put my lawyer hat on here. I'm not going to be throwing sites out. I'm not going to be talking about definitions. I'm really much more interested in talking about processes. So one of the things I think is true in terms of process is that privacy and cybersecurity both have some common principles. And I'm not talking about confidentiality, integrity, and availability. That part I don't care about. What I am talking about are what it takes to do each of those well. And I think one of the things that is true is you can't do privacy, you can't do cybersecurity well without knowing the organization. And there's some basic principles that flow from that. I've identified it here. I'm not going to read them all to you. But it's important that you know the data. I think one of the things that privacy puts a real premium on is knowing where in an organization personal information resides and knowing how it's used and where it's used. And that's separate from the other information that an organization handles. So as we'll talk about in a little bit, one of the key issues for this in terms of knowing the organization's data is being able to break it down in a way that makes sense in terms of talking about it, identifying risks, and moving on. And these slides, I'm not sure if these slides are available now, but I'm happy to share them for further use. And again, they're for whatever they're worth. The other thing that's really important for both cybersecurity and privacy is thinking about the information lifecycle. You pretty much have to start thinking about information when it comes in the door or it's created and follow it all the way through. If you lose track of information at any point during that process, whether you're talking about privacy or you're talking about cybersecurity, you find yourself in a position where there is unaccounted for information and perhaps gaps in the system. So again, not talking about any surprising principles. Hopefully none of this is a surprise. Some of you are probably thinking, wow, this is so obvious. I can't believe somebody's talking to me about this at 8:30 in the morning. But the reason to talk about it is to emphasize that privacy and cybersecurity are not all that far apart. Some of the silos that have previously existed are there for no particularly good reason. So I think part of what comes from this slide, and as we discuss standards, compliance, the kinds of issues that you and I have to deal with on a regular basis, part of the goal is the earlier privacy and cybersecurity coordinate, the less likely they are to be reinventing the wheel. I mean, these really are fairly common principles. If everyone's at the table together, much easier to deal with than each side thinking about it themselves independently. So where do we start running into what I think of as privacy difficulties? I've been Chief Privacy Officer at the Federal Trade Commission for about 2 years now. Before that, I came from a consumer protection background there. I was a litigator at the Department of Justice. So one of the things I try to think about is process improvements. What would I be looking at if I were trying to litigate against an entity? And where would I see breakdowns in process? The times I've had to say no are times when I got involved at the very last minute. So somebody comes to me and says, we want to turn on process X next week. We just want you to look it over and sign off on it. 9 times out of 10, although that's a horrible process, it works fine. You know, people have thought through things, they're not issues. The 10th time is really the problem, right? The 10th time, it's something where there is a problem that is too big to fix in a week let alone a month or a year. It's simply something that, because of the way the process was started and the project was started, you can't do anything about the privacy issues at the tail end. You can try to patch it, you can try to retrofit it, but ultimately what you end up doing is making a risk management decision that says, okay, we're going to accept this. To my mind, as a privacy officer, that's the worst part of my job. I don't ever want my organization to be in that position. So part of what I spend a fair amount of time thinking about, and the reason for the title of the speech, is I want to be the person that's helping support the business operations in a positive way. So privacy is never saying no. Privacy is about saying yes, or yes, but. There might be some modifications to a particular project or particular application, but not something that actually stops an organization dead in the water. And of course, the other issue that we all deal with is that privacy is just one component of an overall operation. So you have the information technology piece, you have the business mission piece, you have stakeholders, you have all these different pressures on an organization. So privacy can't always drive the process, but what it can do is inform the process. So sort of the rest of what I'm going to talk to you about today, and what I hope you'll take away and what you'll talk about in your smaller groups, is how do you start thinking about privacy in that kind of context. So the first thing that some people, I think, can find frustrating is there is no privacy answer. You don't ever finish privacy. It's an ongoing analysis and an ongoing sort of piece of how you look at processes and organizations. So when you talk about privacy, you'll notice I'm not going to talk about definitions. There are lots of different ways to define privacy. So I'm just going to assume that what we talk about when we're talking about privacy is handling personal information. It's clear moving forward that definitions are changing. If you're in the government, you're pretty familiar with the definition of personally identifiable information. But increasingly, it's clear that that doesn't get to it. As data analytics improve, as technology improves, as collection tools improve, the fact that disparate pieces of information might seem to be innocuous until they're put together changes how we have to think about privacy. There's a very active debate going on right now about how far down that path you can go. You know, if you yourself have information that is not personally identifiable and you release it to somebody else who actually compiles it in a way that makes it identifiable, are you on the hook? Should you be on the hook? Those are all great policy issues, but in terms of practical issues, in terms of moving forward, in terms of making decisions about projects and about processes, it's not particularly helpful. So I like to think much more broadly about just generally personal information and think about what privacy is. The answers are going to be different for every government agency. They're going to be different for every organization because it depends on what you as an organization are doing, what your comfort with risk is, and how you're going to interact with the data. If all you're doing is collecting and keeping data, you're not sharing it, you don't have third-party vendors who are touching it, you have a very different environment to do an assessment than a place where you're acting as a clearinghouse for information that everybody's getting to. So when we talk about the kinds of tensions and textures that come into privacy, I try to identify some of the things that can affect privacy and sort of the decisions that we make. Again, it's not an exhaustive list, it's just sort of to give you a feel. And these points are going to differ by organization. The other thing that's interesting that we know about individuals who give us personal information for whatever reason they give it to us, whether we're a law enforcement agency like the FTC, and they give it to us in our law enforcement capacity, whether it's someone trying to get a government benefit, whether it's somebody in the private sector trying to enter into a commercial relationship, is different folks have different expectations about what will happen with that information. And so there's no way you can please everybody. And that's, I think, makes it very difficult because then what we're talking about is what do we say about how we're collecting the information and what we're doing with it? What are the expectations? But that's obviously one of the really important considerations. Having said that privacy is subjective in that sense, privacy is also objective. There are laws, there are rules, there are certain kinds of expectations that we're all expected to comply with. And we read about those in the newspaper every day. When you read about data breach incidents, when you read about people who are outraged to discover that certain things happened, that a commercial mailer was sent to somebody in the name of daughter who died. There are lots of those kinds of things that happen. And so clearly, there is something that people generally agree with. Privacy is somewhere in the midst of all that. I can't tell you what it is, but it's in the middle of all of these kinds of things. You look backward and learn from things that have happened. You try to anticipate where things are going. And all of this means that it's not a check-the-box activity. If I'm a privacy officer in your organization, it's not simply enough for you to come to me and say, here's our project, Here are all the 5 things we talk about. Let us know if you have any questions. And I say, no, and we're done.
Yeah, we're going to track 1.
We have one of those conversations when we start the project. We have another conversation like that as we're moving through the project. And we probably have conversations like that once the project is implemented. It's really an ongoing process. And so that puts a real premium on how you start discussing the project itself.
So, do you want me to tell him after he's done?
So what does that mean? Well, basically what it means is that privacy is a management issue. It's a classic risk management issue in the same way that cybersecurity issues are risk management issues, in the same way that business expenditures are risk management issues. In order to do an effective job, you have to accurately identify the risks that are involved. And again, that talks about how you actually handle the risks that are associated in the issues, and is privacy actually involved? Different organizations take different approaches in terms of how to coordinate. So, for example, the Federal Trade Commission, I sit in the chairwoman's office, I report directly to the chairwoman, and I'm a member of her senior staff. So if there are issues that have tensions between the privacy function and the CIO function and one of our litigating divisions or others, we have that discussion at a very high organizational level, and the issue gets resolved by the head of the organization if necessary. Some organizations put privacy under the Office of General Counsel. They put it in the CIO office, and there's nothing wrong with that structure. It's simply a different way of addressing the issues. And if that works for the organization, that's fine, but it's something that needs to be thought of. One of the things that's happened in government is the privacy activities are relatively new. They're all from sort of 2003 forward in terms of formal compliance-related activities. And each of our agencies has reached sort of different conclusions about how best to do that. And I think one of the hopes is that 853, with the privacy controls as we move forward over the next few years, are going to start standardizing some of those functions in a way that allow us to figure out what approaches are likely to work better. There was a recent GAO report that came out looking at incident responses at some 8 federal agencies, and that talk about sort of overall need for improved guidance in terms of incident response. And hopefully that's the kind of thing that we'll see. We haven't seen as much of that in the private sector yet, in part because there isn't an overarching federal framework in terms of privacy, in terms of data breach activities. So each state has certain expectations. There are certain sectors. So if you think about HIPAA, you think about COPPA, there are some things that work to particular kinds of activities, but no overarching framework. So that puts a real premium, regardless of whether you're in the public sector or the private sector, on having these discussions about what approach is most appropriate for your own entity. Again, I've identified some issues here in terms of how things work. I am not all that unusual in terms of federal agencies. I've got a fairly small formal operation coupled with sort of privacy champions who work throughout the organization and act as facilitators and do a lot of the communications back and forth. Bigger agencies, bigger organizations may have full-blown privacy functions in the same way they have full-blown OCIO operations. Again, it's just a decision that an agency makes based, or an organization makes based on resources, based on available personnel, and based on sort of the decisions they make about how important it is to do this. I think the difficulty, and sort of one of the things I want to talk to you a little bit about today, is it's one thing for an organization to consciously make a decision about how to structure privacy. It's another thing for it to sort of fall into an organization and a structure. So there are a lot of things about privacy that really benefit from an organization-wide discussion in terms of privacy culture, in terms of how much influence you're going to give your privacy officer, your privacy manager, your privacy council, however it's structured. And these are all really important decisions, because one of the things that we know about privacy is things will go wrong. It's just the same as it is with information technology and cybersecurity. You plan for everything, but there will be things that you simply can't control. When those things go wrong, one of the questions you really want to be able to answer in the document is, how did we get to this point? Was it something we should have anticipated and didn't? Was it something that was completely outside the realm of detectability? How do we handle it as a risk management process and move forward? So again, my suggestion for everybody is, when you're talking about privacy as an organization, think about what it's going to look like within your organization. You know, don't pick one person and say, okay, you're the privacy person. Have at it. And that's really not a good approach in terms of thinking about privacy. When we talk about managing privacy, we're talking about sort of the culture of the organization along with a bunch of other pieces. What these pieces lead to is the notion pretty quickly that the earlier you talk about privacy and think about privacy both as an organization and as sort of functionality within a particular project or process, the better off you are. And this concept has been memorialized since probably the 1990s in something called privacy by design. And this is the notion that it's much easier to build privacy into an organization or a process at the outset than it is to try and retrofit it at the last minute into something where it might or might not fit. So there are a couple of ways this plays out. The first is the FTC issued a fairly extensive report on privacy, which I will not bore you with, but I'm happy to give you a site if you want to send me an email afterwards, in March of 2012. And we talked about a number of privacy issues, but one of the big ones we talked about was privacy by design as a way to improve privacy practices for consumer protection organizations. And you can see here the articulation. There's sort of three key components. The first is companies should promote consumer privacy throughout their organizations and at every stage of the development of products and processes. The second is that companies should incorporate substantive privacy protections into their practices. And it's important because this piece includes data security. You can't have good privacy without good cybersecurity, because part of what you're talking about is not just how you handle the information, but how you protect it, how you prevent other people from getting access to it, and how you, as an organization, handle and value that information. So this is where the data security, collection limits, retention, disposal, sort of the information lifecycle basics come into play. And the third is that you need to have comprehensive data management practices to make sure you know where the personal information that you handle is throughout the process. You know, if you're the kind of organization that's using information really creatively, you're combining it, you're compiling other information from other sources, how are you making sure that you don't lose track of the original data? You know, are you flagging it? Do you have data tags? Do you have ways to prevent information from bleeding over? How do you prevent information that's personal information that was collected for a specific purpose from being used for other purposes? It's really those kinds of things. So the Federal Trade Commission sort of used as its bully pulpit this whole notion of privacy by design, but it actually goes back to Ann Cavoukian, who is sort of a force to be reckoned with in the privacy world. Anne is, if you haven't had a chance to hear her speak, I would highly recommend it. She is nominally privacy commissioner in Ontario, and she is somebody who goes around the world talking about privacy, and she works with lots of forward thinkers in terms of privacy. She's working on all sorts of projects for small businesses, for de-identification, re-identification, and a whole host of issues. And what she and her colleagues have done is boiled this notion of privacy by design into sort of a combination of compelling arguments and principles. One of the traditional knocks against privacy has been that no matter how much money you spend on it and how good a job you do, it's a zero-sum game. The idea is, if I do a really, really good job of protecting your personal information, the best I can do is not put you in a worse position than you were in before you came to me and gave me your information. Now, obviously, if you word things like that, it's very hard to make any sort of business case for spending money on privacy personnel, on how you handle data, on tying it to cybersecurity, on doing anything. Because it's essentially a cost of doing business. And what you need to do is boil that cost down to the bare minimum. And what's the bare minimum? Well, the bare minimum is you have one person who's a privacy person who signs off nominally on something, and then you keep your fingers crossed hoping that nothing goes horribly wrong. What Anne and her folks have done is started this conversation about privacy as being an integral part of a business operation. Privacy plays into your trust relationships. It plays into whether people are happy to give you your information. It plays into whether folks would rather deal with you than one of your competitors. It plays into all sorts of things. It becomes sort of a holistic process of who the organization is and how they treat information. Are you one of those organizations that collects information because you can, and you don't think about it, you just grab it because you can, you do whatever the heck you want, you don't care what's happening? Or do you tout to the public that we think carefully about this, we don't collect any more information than we need, we don't keep it any longer than we have to, we understand and value your role, and we want to hear from you? There's this whole sort of dynamic range of things that we can do that actually show that privacy is not a zero-sum, it's something where it's actually a win-win. The other thing that she's done a fair amount of work on, and I would certainly suggest if you haven't had a chance to look at her website, you should, and the sources are here, is she's thought a lot about how you incorporate privacy by design into technology. Because the other thing you hear is, if I have to think about privacy at the outset of the project, it makes it much more clunky because building privacy in anything makes it clunky, and it's simply not worth doing. And one of the things that she and her colleagues have talked about is the fact that if you build privacy incorrectly, it can become a feature. It can become something that allows you to turn a project into something that's much more valuable than it would otherwise be. For those of you who are working not in the public sector, but with the public sector, you've got products, you do contracts, you do consulting. This is something I think is especially important for you because government agencies increasingly are looking for outside sources. We're looking for ways to establish that on particular things that we're looking for, whether it's a product, whether it's a process, that the folks at the other end really understand and get privacy. I can't tell you how often I, as a chief privacy officer, sit in a meeting with contractors or potential contractors, and I feel like I'm asking them questions in a language they don't understand. Privacy by design allows you to actually anticipate the kinds of questions government agencies are going to ask you about from a business perspective, from a compliance perspective, and that's a really valuable thing to have. Everyone gets generally privacy, but it starts to get very, very specific pretty quickly. And so one of the questions I, as a chief privacy officer, have when we're looking at different kinds of solutions, and again, the disclaimer, we're not currently looking for any kinds of solutions, we're simply talking generally, is I want to see that someone actually understands why I'm asking the questions I'm asking. So if we're looking at a web-based solution for something, and someone tells me that they don't know what the tracking technologies are used, that's sort of an alarm bell for me. If I'm looking at a particular mobility process or project, and I'm asking a question about how we ensure that our data remain apart from personal data, it's not just a random question. It's not just, oh yeah, it's isolated. I'm looking for something much deeper. And so again, these privacy by design principles start to look at why we ask the questions we ask and how we think about it and how they play out. So one of the things I always like to do when I talk is instead of talk sort of broadly and generally, I like to give some tips. And so the last 3 slides I have to talk about are tips for thinking about privacy-related issues. And there's sort of 3 categories of things. The first is simply what I think of as privacy-friendly collection and use of personal information. The second one is tips for a privacy-friendly information lifecycle. And the third is going to be what to think about when you think about new projects. Again, these are peculiar to me. They may or may not work in some or all fashions for your organization, but the idea is this is kind of when you sit down at your table to talk about privacy-related issues. These are the kinds of things that I, as a privacy officer, would love to have you think about and would love to have you come talk to me about at some point, hopefully before your project becomes final and you're getting ready to start it the next day. So when we talk about privacy-friendly collection and use of personal information, again, there's a whole bunch of tips here. I don't want to read them all to you verbatim, but I know that they're also a little hard to see. So there are a couple I want to highlight. The first is, if you work for an organization, whether it's in the public sector or private sector, and you're collecting personal information, and you don't know what personal information your organization is collecting or why it's collecting it, that's bad. There's sort of a legacy system where people have always done something a certain way, and it's really easy to keep doing it that same way. But it's also bad. As privacy changes, you may be collecting information that you no longer need or use. If you read any randomly selected incident reports, you'll see things that don't make sense. So, for example, I was in law school back in the late 80s and early 90s. And shortly after I got to the Federal Trade Commission, I got an incident notice from a company that had provided school loans for me for 1 year when I was an undergraduate in the early 80s. And they were telling me that in the mid-90s they had lost that data. So one of the obvious questions is, why did they still have that data? I hadn't had any relationship with them for well over 15 years at that point. These kinds of issues are important. So knowing what information your organization collects, why it collects it, occasionally revisiting whether you still need to collect it. Perhaps things have changed. Perhaps your ability to identify a particular entity from information has changed, so you no longer need to collect the Social Security number. Those kinds of things are important dialogues to have. The other thing I really want to emphasize, whether you're in the public sector, the private sector, whether you're a vendor or an organization, is vendor management issues are unbelievably important in terms of data flow. You need to make sure that whatever principles your organization has established in terms of how it's going to handle and collect and use data are not only flowed through to your vendors, but that you have a way to audit it, you have a way to look at it, and you have a way to ensure that you know what your vendors are doing. Now, I'm about to run out of time here, so I want to get quickly to a couple of other things. When we talk about privacy-friendly information life cycles, one of the things that we're talking about is making sure that you know where personal information is at all points in the organization from the time you collect it until the time you get rid of it. And one of the things I also want to flag is if you're an organization that decides that you can keep information by de-identifying it, anonymizing it, or aggregating it, really important to know how you're doing that, what the principles are, and sort of what the defenses are in case it does get re-identified. Some of the privacy experts, Paul Ohm, Latanya Sweeney, and others, are very skeptical about whether it's possible to completely de-identify data. You know, that as our technology improves, as our processes and information analysis tools improve, it may be possible to re-identify information that previously couldn't be. This is sort of part of the big data discussion, data analytics discussion. So there's a risk component involved, and it's important to make sure that you and your organization have thought about that risk component. And then a final plug in terms of new technology. Government agencies are under increasing pressure to go mobile, to allow folks to bring personal devices, to move to the cloud, to use apps, to use web-based tools. Those are all great. In some cases, they're much more cost-effective than anything government agencies can do on their own. But they all have privacy-related issues to it. So it's important when you find the latest cool tool to have the discussions about the privacy implications. It's not to say, no, we're not going to do it, but it's to recognize and identify the issues so that you as an organization can make an intelligent, informed decision about what kinds of issues you care about and what risks might be associated with it. So you're not surprised when something goes wrong. I was talking to folks before things started about an entity that shall remain nameless that decided to roll out bring your own devices. And so they had wonderful smartphones that folks were using and tablets that they were connecting. They could download things to their device from the network. And yet, for information security and privacy purposes, these devices were not treated as being part of the network. So not surprisingly, they lost track of devices, they lost track of data, and that's incident territory pretty quickly. And there's no good reason for it. You know, some discussions in advance would have taken care of that. Finally, some tips for new projects. And these are sort of what I try to get folks at the FTC to think about and do as we're walking through it. And again, a little hard to read. We'll get these available. Let me just say, so the first thing is, start with the question, am I going to be collecting personal information or working with personal information in some capacity? If the answer to that is yes, please get your privacy folks involved sooner rather than later. The kinds of questions this triggers are, how's the information going to be used? How am I going to explain those uses to the people I'm collecting it from? How's the personal information going to be maintained and secured? Am I going to lump it in with all the other information I have, which small organizations often do, and that's fine if you take the appropriate cybersecurity and privacy practices. But you at least need to think about it. You can't simply assume that personal information and the rest of the information can all be treated the same way. Who's going to have access to it? Again, lots of folks would have network access who don't necessarily need to touch particular kinds of information, and it's important to think about whether that works for your organization or whether you want to restrict it. So, again, there are no answers. It's just questions. I'm great at asking questions. The answers differ. Are you going to be combining information that you collect with other kinds of information? If you are, how are you going to make sure that you maintain the integrity of the information? How long are you going to retain it? What are you going to do with it when you get rid of it? Really basic questions. And for most government agencies, these kinds of questions fall into privacy impact assessments that we all use. And PIAs are good discipline for private sector as well. If you're a contractor providing services, I think increasingly agencies are going to be asking you to participate in the PIA process to make sure that you both understand why we're doing the privacy piece, and also to make sure that you're willing to sign off. Because one of the things that happens is a PIA is a way to establish what functionality is for a particular product or process. And so one of the good ways to do that is we can say what we think it's going to do, but if you as the provider are willing to sign off and say, yes, this is what it does, and you've identified the risks correctly, even better. And I think when we talk about sort of public-private partnerships, that's one of the areas where we're likely to see a lot of movement. Because increasingly as government agencies move to sort of these third-party services, we're less comfortable with what happens to the information when it's not in our control. Maria says, you know, government agencies are really risk averse. That's true. One of the ways you can help us be less risk averse, I think, is by partnering with us in really substantive ways. And I think privacy and cybersecurity both are really good substantive ways to do that. And then, how will the privacy analysis remain current? And this is important. We've all worked on projects where we've started with pretty clear goals, and then as we've sort of moved forward, those goals have changed. You hear from person A who says, well, you know, since we're doing this anyway, it would be great if we could add this. And person B does this. And then you move it forward, and at some point your funding gets cut. So you have to slash everything in half and strip it back down. If you're still working with the same privacy analysis that you had when you began, where you're ending up doesn't look much like it. And so there's a sort of ongoing role with that. And with that, I'm going to stop and just say that I think privacy is important. It's something that we're clearly seeing more of. There have been increasing incidents. Some of that's unavoidable, but my goal as a privacy officer always is to make sure that if there is going to be an incident, it's accidental or it's the kind of intentional thing that's unpreventable. You know, we all talk about the advanced persistent threats. We're familiar with the external hacks. And so somewhere in between there is where privacy needs to live. Privacy needs to anticipate the things that are reasonable, flag them. Organization can decide whether the risk is worth paying for to avoid or not, but at least you've identified it. And that gives a great deal of comfort if a regulator like the FTC comes in, if you're faced with a private class action, whatever else happens. If you actually know that you've thought through the process and you've documented it in some ways, you're ahead of the game. So all of that is a plea to talk to me and people like me, both within your organization and otherwise. I love talking about this stuff. I only have half an hour, so that's it. I have to stop. But if you want to follow up with me, I'm happy to do that. We've got lots of resources on the FTC website. Increasingly, there are lots of good government resources on privacy, including the Federal CIO Council has a privacy committee that's very active. I'm on it with a lot of my counterparts at other federal agencies. So there's lots of good stuff about it. And privacy should not be integral. Privacy needs to be just one of those business processes that goes along with information technology, that goes along with marketing, that goes along with the rest of it. It's just part of the overall picture. So with that, I'll leave you, and I'll encourage all of you to please ask good, hard questions and think about things when we have our breakout sessions.
All right. Thanks, Mia. Actually, do you mind staying up here if they're going to field some questions? Okay. So we got a little bit of time, so why don't we field like a couple questions, like 2 or 3 questions. Does anyone have any questions over here? Yes.
Yeah, Colin Suter with Deloitte. I've worked sort of on and off over the years with activity, and I guess back to the mid-90s when some approaches to Wi-Fi metrics there. And one of the things I guess I've noticed over that time with privacy by design as a bit of a challenge is the lack of technical implementation standards. So it tends to get to a level where there is privacy by design, but then the implementation, to a certain extent, is black box in terms of technology implementation. Are you seeing a similar challenge in terms of lack of standards in the area? And if so, do you have any suggestions on how that could be resolved?
This is an interesting area. The FTC in particular gets a lot of criticism for pretty much anything we do in the area of technology for some of the reasons that you're suggesting. The cynics would say that technology moves so much more quickly than government moves that it doesn't make sense to have legislation and it doesn't make sense to have regulation. I think one of the things that we talk about when we talk about technology is if folks are thinking about and talking about privacy as sort of the privacy by design principle has, you at least are better off than if you've not had the conversation. I think in terms of technical standards, you always get the question about whether if someone's imposing a technical standard, who's imposing it? Is it a single company that says, hey, this is a standard that everyone should be using? Is it a government agency that's saying, yes, this is the right standard to use, and then everybody gets kind of stuck and it turns out to be outdated? You know, it's ISO is sort of one approach to standards. Folks have likes and dislikes about sort of the ISO approach, but I think that's an area where it's simply you're moving the ball a little bit down the road. But I think Anne and others have not yet said here's the standard that everyone should be hitting. It's much more just about thinking about it and incorporating. I don't think there's a good answer. I wish I could tell you there was.
Any more questions?
My question was very similar along this line, but the response, so to say a comment to what you say is that I know that DHS and other folks were doing work in this area where they were developing the NEAMS framework, or the National Information Exchange Model, and where it implemented a lot of the principles of and privacy by design on dealing with data level tagging. So that's one area, or I think one suggestion I can say that maybe more organizations should start looking at how they can participate in such type of working group on like discussion in building that out. And there's a way we can kind of advocate for such adoption throughout the government. Because I know that's one of the challenges we faced was getting other agencies to get on board with with such work. So maybe some suggestions around like going that route.
And I think, one of the things that we often talk about in areas like this, we talk about sort of self-regulation, we talk about industry best practices. And so one of the things that happens is if you can develop a consensus, you don't end up with a technical standard the way you were talking about, but you end up at least with sort of practices that are in a comfort zone that are generally accepted. And I think particularly right now where we don't have national cybersecurity bills, we don't have national data breach incident bills, it's a good opportunity to sort of try and build some of that consensus. You see a little bit of that in the NIST process that's ongoing right now with the public-private cybersecurity framework. And it's interesting, if you read the documentation that's been happening there, you'll see that privacy is pretty controversial. And you'll see that there at least had floated the notion of having privacy controls very similar to what's included in 853. And the assertion that came in from private industry was there's no consensus that those actually do what people think they do. So again, there's this ongoing discussion. I don't know that you're going to be able to please everybody, but I agree as a general matter that whether you're government agencies, whether you're sort of a public-private partnership like this organization, there are ways you can sort of develop and advance the thinking in a useful way. And I think the way you do that is by incorporating privacy and the privacy by design principles. Even if you may disagree at the highest level about where that takes you, you've at least got sort of a foundation. And I think that's better than where we are now.
So the question I had was the privacy impact assessment processes, the system of record notices have been in place for a long time, and they were really put in place at a time that predates open data and sharing and mashup and the kind of stuff that's possible now. And I guess the question I'm asking is, do you think those processes are flexible enough and adaptable enough to deal with these new challenges, or do those underlying processes need to be changed to cope with the new reality?
I will be very careful and before I answer, reiterate that I am speaking purely for myself. Privacy Act goes back to 1974. We have the eGov Act. We have, for federal government agencies, we have guidance for how to respond to data breach incidents that goes back 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, which is decades in the technology environment. I think the goal is always to apply things as flexibly as possible. What I do at my agency is where there seem to be gaps or disconnects where a particular process doesn't account for what we're seeing in terms of new technology. For example, as we move into the social media area, as we move into some of the other areas, is we make an intelligent risk management kind of decision where we can identify that there is something that doesn't quite fit in with the existing framework, but because of what we're doing, we need to be able to move forward. And that's a good example of what I was discussing earlier, which is the need to make sure that you think about and process and document decisions that you make. So they're still important for guidance purposes. I think particularly as we see what's happening right now with NSA, like them or hate them, the Snowden issues, all the rest of it, it's really putting a premium on the kinds of decisions that agencies and organizations make in terms of handling personal information. And so I think it puts a real premium on having thought through the issues. You don't want the first time an issue comes up to be an incident or a phone call from a reporter or a phone call from Brian Krebs or something of that sort. You don't want to have to deal with that. You want to know, well, yes, this was one of the gaps that we identified, and here's what we tried to do to resolve it. I think, if we're talking about, and to use Maria's phrase, we're talking about government agencies as risk-averse entities. The danger for all of us collectively is that it's going to be very difficult for us to move forward if we see ourselves as stuck with guidance that may be a bit outdated. And I think that's a challenge. I think that's part of why there's the Open Government Initiative, the Digital Initiative, that are trying to sort of move us forward from our fairly creaky, fairly legacy approaches to things. And, we're not as nimble as we'd like to be. Resources are hard to come by, so it's a real challenge.
Peter, I have a question. Thank you very much for your talk today and laying a great groundwork. I've heard you use the word move the ball forward, keep your options open, and the privacy discussion really always does look at social media and where we're going. Could you make a comment or clarify what you think about retroactive privacy and on some of the data that already exists or is stored, and maybe some of the things that you're seeing and how to handle data that's already there to changing laws or changing practices?
Yeah, I'd say that's probably one of the most challenging issues. I think as our thinking about privacy gets more sophisticated, we obviously we as an agency, organizations, have information that was collected and handled in systems that were not necessarily designed to do where we'd like to go now, what we'd like to do, how we'd like to handle it. In terms of the thinking, I would say that, again, you're responsible for all the information your organization has, regardless of whether you collected it 10 years ago or yesterday. And so the idea, you can just say, well, that's outdated, so we're not going to look at it, we're not going to think about it. I don't think we have the luxury of doing that. I think if you're an organization in the private sector, you've got 46, perhaps 47, if Kentucky does what it looks like it's going to do, different state laws that talk about data breach and notification. And those laws are not conditioned on how long you've had the information. It's simply conditioned on did that get out there. So I think as part of the process I was talking about in terms of assessing the information life cycle, part of what you need to be thinking about is information that is pre-existing. It's not just new. In terms of how the NIST 853 implementation process was set up, it was set up so that systems that were in existence, you have a longer window for implementing than you do for new systems to bring online. And I'd say that's about the only accommodation I'm aware of in terms of federal government agencies that give you a little more time to think about this very difficult issue about pre-existing systems and pre-existing information. But again, I come back to my mantra, which is identify it, document it, think about the risks. If you decide there's something you can do about it, you should. If you decide you can't do something about it, at the very least, you've identified the issue and you can create a POAM for it. You can accept the risk. You can decide that you're going to get rid of all the data and start over again if your records practices and everything else allow you to do that. But I think it's a real challenge. I think particularly for some of the sort of the data broker type activities, some of that legacy data is really important. It's not information that anyone's going to voluntarily give up simply because they didn't have all the right fences around it. So I think it's much more about what do you do with the data as you have it. So that's my non-answer. I don't know that anybody has a good answer to that question.
All right, let's give a round of applause again for Peter for the presentation and remarks.